All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's talk climate change, a really exciting subject that is always sunny and happy and has no downsides. I want to give you a quick introduction to our panelists. You can read their full illustrious bios in your paperwork, but real quick at the end there, we've got David Martin, CEO of development firm Terra. We've got Patrick Murphy, the Chief Investment Officer of Builder Coastal Construction and Managing Director of Renco. We've got Amy Knowles, the Chief Resilience Officer for Miami Beach, and Hector Silva, CEO of Prive Advisory Group, part of Bayview International Realty. And we gathered these folks together today so we could have a really informed and broad-ranging conversation with you guys about building for the future. It sounds like a nice slogan, right? But there's so much to it. We know a couple of things about climate change down here, right? We know that it's happening. You don't have to read headlines to know that. You just have to want to take your boat out or cross your street without having to take your shoes off, or walk down the street and catch a bus without dying of heat stroke. This is a real present problem that affects all of us in so many ways, not just the environment we walk around in, but our financial investments. For most people, a home is every penny of your generational wealth, and we are worried that there are changes to the value of our homes, the value of our commercial properties. Insurance is something that is definitely awesome, and the prices are great, and no one has any complaints in Florida. And climate change affects tendrils of every single aspect of our lives down here, and part of the work this team does is we work really hard to bring that to our readers. We want to show them that not only do you have agency, your choices matter here, because one thing we know about climate change is it's real, it's happening, it's human caused, but something else we know is that there are solutions. It is not a given that everything is going to go underwater in 50 years. Physics is one thing, but we can build. We can build better, we can build differently, and we can build in higher ground, we can build in more density. There are numerous solutions that this community honestly is at the forefront of internationally. And today we brought a bunch of those folks who can talk about some of those solutions and really bring them to you. So we're gonna start out with a question for all of the panelists. I think it's a question that everybody kind of asks, right? When you're at a cocktail party and you meet someone who works in climate change, and how have you seen trends in development and building shift due to climate change in South Florida over the years? And maybe we can start with Hector. I believe you can, mic's on, there's a little on button. If it's not already on, you should see something on the screen, then you'll know it's on.
It's on. Thank you. Okay. Thank you for the question, and thank you guys also for having us and all of the awesome introductions. That was really wonderful to hear and see the passion here for resilience and improvements to essentially our collective future. I would say that in the past 15 years, which is the amount of time that I've been in real estate and real estate development, what I've seen is that inevitably you have new construction that is coming up on waterfronts, right? So Miami is a place where the first thing that most people think of is the water, no matter where you are in the world. We have a global brand that is really, it has taken off even before the pandemic. I was here before, many of you probably were too. And the pandemic has really kind of increased that as well. And this waterfront new construction certainly is doing a lot to, let's say, the way that things are being built. A lot of mitigation is being put in place in terms of the elevations at which these structures are built, whereas you might have had the lobby of your building, many, many years ago, sort of near the ground level. Now the lobby of your building might be on the second or the third floor. Some of the mechanicals are shifted up so that they're not necessarily impacted by flooding. So there are a lot of things that have been happening that I've seen in a technical way that we end up having to explain to clients if, for instance, they're looking at buildings that are on the water. And in general, we've just seen that, I think, every year there's some kind of technological innovation that relates to how we account for not just flooding, but also wind hazards and other hazards that are really being exacerbated by climate change. So generally, when we have people that are coming in from the outside, they're always asking about these things. I think once you've got someone that lives in Miami and is from Miami, they've kind of accepted the risks in a certain way. But when you've got, as we have now, many New Yorkers, people from New Jersey, people from Illinois, from California, that are moving here, they all have their own sets of climate climate risks that they also deal with. But I think for some people, the prospect of a hurricane and flooding and high tides is very different than perhaps a wildfire or an earthquake, even though those to me are also quite scary. But we certainly have to delve into those topics with clients more and more as climate has become a higher talking point I think, in the overall social narrative. Yeah.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Alex, for reaching out, and it's really a pleasure to be here today. I mean, I kind of feel that I have grown up throughout my career with climate in South Florida. You know, I was originally from upstate New York, and I remember being in college at Binghamton University, and I went to a special seminar, one that our professors encouraged us to go to, and it was about sea level rise. And I remember saying, who would ever live in Florida, and who would ever live in Miami? They're so vulnerable, and this was quite some time ago. I'm not going to tell you the year. Fast forward to me moving down here, and I remember flipping up manholes in the middle of the street trying to find sources of pollution because I had started with the environmental department with the county at the time. And there still was not a lot of talk about sea level rise. There was talk about climate change and sustainability, but really what that impact could be. You know, and fast forward a few more years, and I think it was around 2013 where we really all started to see an acceleration. We started to see more king tides. We started to see, rather than 1 or 2 events a year exceeding thresholds, maybe there was 17 events. Actually, there have been 17 events annually on average between 2014 and last year. So these events have been increasing. So we've seen that, we've witnessed that. You know, my first day on the job on Miami Beach, I distinctly remember being in Sunset Harbor, that neighborhood when you cross the Venetian Bridge and you see, you know, Purdy Avenue, and one side of the road was 2.5 feet higher than the other side of the road. And I still use that picture, you know, in presentations today. So I do consider Miami Beach in South Florida the living laboratory for climate change. We're living this, we're experiencing this, and we've seen those changes. So our city did act pretty quickly. You know, I would say it was almost an emergency basis going into Sunset Harbor and elevating streets, adding in new stormwater pumps, trying to do the best urban planning along the way, you know, taking parking off of the streets, adding in different multimodal parking. You know, we've elevated seawalls. We rose Maurice Gibb Park up 2 feet and did a beautiful step down seawall so you can look at the bay, doubled the size of the living shoreline. Any opportunity that we can integrate sustainability into resilience into the work we do, we do. And we've been lucky to have been able to afford it. We also have to do it. You know, our infrastructure is aging, and as it's aging, it is time to incrementally adapt. Why not invest? And all the numbers show us that we need to, and it's worth it, and people know that. So I would say in 2016 or so, we adopted all these amendments to our land development code, higher seawalls, higher ground elevation, more permeable surfaces, so many different things, building higher. You know, we actually had required higher than base flood elevation before the Florida Building Code even required it. So we've really tried to lead the way, and we knew we had to do a whole overhaul in our land use regulations. And our code now today is actually called the Resilience Code. And we're never going to be done, and we're going to be continually changing. But I think we've just seen it, we've experienced it, and I could talk forever, but we have so many examples from neighborhoods being completely overhauled and changed, to parks and green spaces, to homes. You know, they're so much taller now, and they're so much higher, and that's a good thing, and it's a challenge for some. But, you know, 75% of our property is privately owned, so it's important we think about those 14 historic districts where people are not redeveloping in the same way we think about those new homes. So I think that we've kind of seen it all, and we're not done.
Thank you. Thank you for the opening comments. I agree with everything that was said and all the nice remarks. With what Julie said and the mayor said, reiterating, our climate is our economy, right? I think that's a great starting point and foundation for us to have this conversation. And what you were just saying about that public-private partnership is critical. We have so many great leaders like David Martin in the private sector that are taking the initiative to do the right thing and build right. But if we zoom out for a second and think about, you know, what's happening, and from a construction standpoint, that's my background, we have to relook at the way we build. Right? And if you think about it, for the last 100+ years, there's basically been 3 ways to build. wood, metal, steel, and concrete. Right? Those are 3 ways. And if you look at concrete, right, and you look at the built environment as a whole, 40% of global emissions are from the built environment. Right? About 20% is at the materials. Concrete itself is 8% of all global emissions. Right? If concrete were a country, it'd be the 4th largest polluter in the world. And look around, right? That's the go-to. And so when I say a public-private partnership, it's critical that the public, the government, is helping to incentivize new ways to build, because there's a lot of really new cool technologies out there, right? That there's a lot of things that are really changing, but getting them approved is very difficult. So let's lean into these new technologies. Let's help incentivize those new technologies. Let's help the approvals of those. Let's ensure that if a developer is going to take the risk to do that, that they have a little extra credit, right? Maybe there's a tax credit, maybe there's a little extra density, maybe they get expedited approvals. Like, there's so many things that we can do, I believe, to help incentivize more new green building technologies, because we can't keep doing things the same old way. Right? And you think about where we live and everything that's been said, it's pretty obvious that the pain felt from climate change is more acute, and we're going to feel it more here. We're all in this together, there's no doubt. No one's immune from this, but we should be leading the way and setting the example for how to build and develop better for the whole world. So I think there's a lot of really cool opportunities, and I think there's a lot of great leaders in this room that are starting to do that.
Thanks, Patrick. Great. I think when we think about what's happening with technology and in our industry, there used to be, like, when you go to a doctor and the doctor's, maybe, older, right? And he has a different way of doing things, right? And then you always want to go to the new doctor that maybe has this special way of, doing, working on a spine or special surgery, but the old doctor doesn't want to try that. And that's what we've seen transitioning over the last 20 years, I think, which is all the public works directors, when we come in with green infrastructure ideas, they're like, that's pixie dust. Like, we just gotta, we gotta do things our old ways. And I think what we're seeing now is government, and with leadership like Amy, really thinking about new ways of doing things and using green infrastructure and seeing how we could, polish our stormwater and kind of use that in a favorable way to help our bay. And so I think when we think of, the private sector and the public sector, it's really a very strong collaboration. There's, a lot of technical details when we're designing cities and we're trying to make them more resilient. Are we designing to a 100-year storm? Are we designing to a 500-year storm? And if you design a 500-year storm, you're not going to have so many homes or so many townhomes, and so the assets kind of change in value. But definitely think that over the last 10, 20 years, the priority of climate change, the priority of investing in infrastructure and doing smart design, I think is becoming a kind of a higher priority in the resource allocation. At the end of the day, government, private sector, we all have budgets, and we all have to allocate how much money we're going to spend on certain things, and we typically want to invest in things that are going to create some economic impact and also protect neighborhoods. And I think the data and the research on the economic side is proving that investing in infrastructure is going to shore up property values. It's going to create incremental property values. And so I think on the new construction side, we're all looking at the innovation that Patrick's firm's doing, and we all want to participate in it. We want to participate in 3D printing and those types of things. But when we really think about the existing infrastructure, which is probably 95% of what we have to work with, we really need to work with government and with private owners. We have, one of the big things for us is how do we store water, right? And how do you get a building in Miami Beach that's a condominium with 300 or 500 unit owners to agree to say, hey, we need to store water because we have a flooding problem, and we need to hire a civil engineer, go permit, and really figure out how we could have our asset or our land or our garage or whatever participate into this program. And going back to what Patrick said, incentives is where we got to focus. People are going to do things if they're incentivized to do it. We all have a common responsibility and goal, of protecting the environment. But when it costs and there's, money and there's no return on that, it's very difficult for people to make those decisions. So I definitely think there's a lot of innovation right now, I think, in the collaboration and public-private partnerships with government. We've worked on some, and I'm looking to do more. But definitely see also, going back to Alex's question, I just see the younger generation just talking about it. Like my son, when he comes from school, he's talking about the environment. He's talking about, the flooding. He's talking about, clean energy. He's talking about these things that I just think that younger generation's really embracing it. And I think over the next 10, 20 years, we're going to see huge innovation. Thank you.
Amy, we know that this is going to be very, very expensive, everything that we have to adapt to and that we've already adapted to. And we talked about how, the public-private partnerships are very important, the private sector is very important, but a lot of the bill is going to be paid by local governments. And Miami Beach is obviously on the forefront of tackling a lot of these adaptation challenges. You've invested so much already into building a dune system, into draining neighborhoods, raising roads. There's so much that's going on. I'm wondering, how does that already benefit the local population? And also, do they see it? Do they appreciate it? Do they know that it's, that these adaptations are working to some extent at least?
So yes, we have, we started early and we're still working on this. And I like to say we're doing it one budget at a time. This is very expensive. We have been pretty successful bringing in about $80 million in grant funding through Resilient Florida and other places. But we have a lot of lessons learned early on. I think one of the best examples that people forget about is our beaches and our dune system. Well, first of all, Miami Beach does protect the mainland, so let's thank Miami Beach for that. And we are the barrier island, so we offer a lot of protection value in that way. But we need to protect ourselves as well. And 50 years ago, we barely had a beach. We certainly didn't have a dune system. So it is a phenomenal example of nature-based protections, green infrastructure. It has created an ecosystem, the dune systems do. And we just remember that there's so much we can do. The Army Corps frequently produces some great information, and one of them is that it has a protective value of about $20 million a year. Every dollar invested in beach renourishment equals about $550 in taxes from tourism. So we have great examples, and I think people not only, that's kind of, all that's based on modeling, what does that mean? But I think people experience it as well. For quality of life, people enjoy the beaches, people enjoy the beach walk. It's actually a major mobility corridor for us now. And our dune system isn't something to be detested because it blocks views. It's actually something people really enjoy. And it adds to the whole experience of Miami Beach. So I think people do see that. They may not realize the protective value. I can tell you it's fascinating with the new flood maps and the firms that came out. There's areas along our dune system that are really high, and technically flood insurance isn't even required on the west side of the dunes. People should still get flood insurance. But it's very interesting to see how those protections have even, changed through FEMA modeling, that there's improvements. So that's a good thing. I know in some neighborhoods like Sunset Harbor, for example, we did a study because this is so expensive, and how can we communicate this to people, and will it hurt property values? I mean, some people thought, if this project comes down my street, you're going to kill my property values. And so we did what government does. We did a study, and we looked for the business case analysis. And what it showed is, those huge studies out there that say we're going to have all this loss from climate change and all this loss from sea level rise. Well, the inverse is true. If you elevate, if you do this work, you're going to have less loss, and you can also see improvements. And so we did a model with risk modeling, economic modeling, and engineering, and it showed Sunset Harbor alone increased $40 million in value. So the numbers are there. It's an experienced and lived quality of life. We've seen over 200 avoided tidal flood incidents in that neighborhood, and we try to tell that story. Do people know? There can always be a worse storm event. We can't protect people from everything. You're going to have hurricanes that, people need to evacuate. the category 5, we need to leave, and people shouldn't stay in their home, and please don't stay. And we can't build a coastal city for that level. So I think it's about setting expectations. It's about communicating it to people, and we're still doing that. We just opened up Bayshore Park on Sunday, and that really is a huge innovation project for blue-green infrastructure, where instead of discharging stormwater to the bay, which everybody does in Miami, which is really a challenge for our water quality, we created a stormwater retention lake. That took 2 years to get through the environmental regulatory processes. It is a massive feat, and it is being built in such a way that can intake the stormwater from the surrounding neighborhoods once that project is completed. So we're innovating, we're experimenting. It's hard. We hope others can learn about what we're doing. But again, it's opportunities. The Parks Administration building there is solar. What a phenomenal opportunity for solar. We don't get to do that a lot because our buildings are so old. So as much as we can integrate those sustainability options, we're doing that as well.
Thanks, Amy. So I'm going to jump to David, and you gave me a perfect launching point, Amy, because when it comes to developers have a unique opportunity very often in Florida, where you get to design a new lot from scratch. You get to rethink the whole space, not retrofit something that's already there. And you touched on this in your comments earlier, but very often, it sounds like for you, part of that conversation is, what do we do with the water? Yes, there are rules at the state level of how much water you have to maintain, but often your projects, you've talked a little bit more about, well, can we hold more water than that? Can it be a benefit to the surrounding area? Tell us about how you think about, not just tidal flooding, but rain. Like, how do you make these new pieces of property that don't just keep themselves from flooding, but maybe also offer benefits to surrounding communities?
Yeah, great. I think definitely it's a challenge. Sometimes we're dealing with state roads, sometimes we're dealing with county roads and city roads, and we're always trying to harmonize kind of different elevations. We definitely start kind of looking at the neighborhood scale, right? So it's not only just property specific, but what's happening around us, right? And sometimes just when you're doing the community outreach, they tell you where things are flooding, right? And typically the community that lives next to the neighborhoods knows more about the neighborhood and about water than any developer coming in there. But the main thing is, how do we just store water, right? How do we polish it? We, in Miami Beach, working with Amy in the city, we built a park that had these water quality wells. That basically there's actually a pump station that's really one of the primary pump stations for South Beach that was pumping, not the nicest things into our bay. And I think these water quality wells was all the stormwater got redirected to these wells, stored, polished, and then went into the pump. And then we kind of saw the better, no nutrient overload situations, and we're able to track that. So I think water quality is really important in anything we do. Seeing what our impact is to neighbors, right? Sometimes we elevate and the neighbors are lower. And so how do we harmonize that? We may have to set back a little more to kind of adjust for that condition. How do we incentivize neighbors to invest in their properties? We're working, for instance, in North Beach right now, and we're trying to organize the business community and the real estate community start investing in their properties and improving the infrastructure, not only the beautification or making it more walkable or better trees or better wayfinding or signage, but also investing in the infrastructure and fortifying their buildings. And so, a lot of challenges we have at Miami Beach as it relates to historic preservation and how all that works. And and I think there's some, new ideas that are coming about, but I definitely think that studying our neighborhoods at a neighborhood scale, trying to see how our developments can create incremental tax revenue to then, be able to earmark to specific projects within a neighborhood to kind of improve it, or just, I think is critical. And also just, working with the municipality that you're in to try to figure out, why, certain times, infrastructure projects, the can gets kicked. Permitting is permitting is difficult, budgeting is difficult, and so really how do we start thinking about prioritizing our neighborhoods, right? We were working in Overtown, for instance, and we have a property there, and we were looking at kind of, how to make it more walkable, how do we create more tree canopy, and having healthy trees, because some people have taught me that there's certain trees that aren't healthy and there's certain trees that are. I mean, and health is, public health is kind of an overlay here that, having better infrastructure and more shade and better parks and making it easy to connect to work or connect to for quality of life purposes. I think public health is such an important part of all of our decisions and everything we're doing here that I think that can also drive some of the decision making and maybe start ranking up some of these investments to be more a priority than just sometimes we use incremental, we use protection of property values, but I think urban planning and kind of the public health aspect I think can also really help drive the decisions. And I know there's there's this Planetary Health Institute that I visited in DC that's working with the business, the public health, the public health school or administration school and the business school and kind of the environmental science, and they were all working on a collaboration, because this issue is kind of touches so many different disciplines. It's not really that easy, right? It's just requires so many different thinkers to work together and get aligned. And so, but definitely think that all our developments, we're trying to just bring in the best experts and the best advisors to kind of help us make smart decisions.
So there's different strategies to build smarter, working with the tools we have, but there's also people looking to add new tools to the toolbox altogether. Patrick, your company has pioneered this unique form of construction that's often compared to Legos, but trying new things means the state of Florida has to approve it. What's the process like to convince regulators to let you try something new?
Thank you. So the name of the company is RENCO, stands for Renewable Composites. I say that as sort of a preview, not as a promotion. It's made of recycled glass, recycled plastic, calcite, which is like a limestone dust, and then a resin that holds it all together. And we were introduced to this product in 2010 after the earthquake in Haiti. And we flew down to Haiti right after that earthquake and wanted to help out and do some work, and immediately realized that it would be very difficult to build traditional methodologies, right? The workforce, materials, et cetera. So we started looking at new building materials, and we were introduced to this company called RENCO that was invented in Turkey. We flew to Turkey, long story short, we saw it. They were building 10-story apartments with it. People were living in it. They had all sorts of structures that were built. And we said, holy cow, this is like too good to be true, right? And we brought it back to the US, started doing our own independent testing. And in many tests, it was stronger than concrete. Like, this is crazy, right? We know some people locally. We do some construction here. We'll get this approved in a year or two. Well, it ended up taking 10 years. 450 unique tests that have to be done in sequential order, and some of these tests, single tests, take 6 to 9 months, because getting a new building system approved is a lot of work, and there's a lot of great attributes to that. Don't get me wrong, it's life safety, whether it's a plane, a car, a boat, where you live, right? Like, we have to be in safe places. But there's also a lot of nonsense that goes into it, without getting too deep into it. Everything from fire to off-gassing to strength to hurricane to earthquake was all tested. And they gave us a 3x safety rating on top of what concrete would have been. So not only do you have to be as strong as concrete or metal or wood equivalent, you have to be 3 times stronger, right? Imagine that. So what I learned along the way, and I don't want this to come off like we're bragging or something. The point is, though, it took a decade to do this. Way more resources and time than we thought. And there are dozens or hundreds of new ideas that could be better than ours, I don't know, that are dying on the vine because of this process. And there's so little incentive to get these new things done. And we were lucky and persevering and just stubborn Irish guys, I guess, that just kept pushing through to now get this approved. And it's now the 4th building material approved in the world, right? Wood, concrete, metal are the first 3. And with this material, it's stronger, lighter, faster, greener. It's recycled materials, about 80% greener than concrete, and it's less expensive. So now the next big hurdle, just to go a little bit further, isn't just the approvals, it's now acceptance. Right? It's now getting people to change their ways. And construction is one of the most antiquated industries that exist. There was an interesting study that McKinsey did recently that showed over the last 50 years, there's been a 0% increase in productivity in construction. Every other industry is up 2x, 3x, 10x in others. Construction's flatlined. In many cases, it's gone backwards. So there's something broken fundamentally. The point is there are new ideas, there's new technologies. We are one of many that are out there. There is 3D printing, there's modular, there's prefab. Without getting too deep into AI and all the opportunity that's there, but I'm very confident that AI is going to take all the historical data of every building that's been built, learn from that, learn the local code, and compress what's normally 18 to 24 months and 25% of a budget down to mere days and a minute fraction of the budget. Because AI, and within 5 years, is going to be a prompt where you can get the exact building you want with very few inputs. I believe in the future, if you want to build a new house, you're going to give it the address, the budget, the style, and what you want. And you're going to get a full set of working drawings, not just like a pretty picture. You're going to get the mechanical, the electrical, the plumbing, the structure, and it's all going to be drawn up to code because that's what AI was coded, was drawn to do. So imagine that world, how quickly things can change if we start adapting technology, whether it's new materials, AI, to improve the way we build. We're going to save a lot of money and hopefully, bigger picture, solve this workforce housing crisis we have in our country, right? And help more people get in homes and do it in an environmentally friendly way.
Dying on the vine, what a phrase. I think you are not the only one in this panel who's jumped onto that theme, because Hector, you told us in a pre-call that you've actually had similar experiences where people that you've worked with have really tried to make new innovative technologies work and had struggled through the regulatory process. Tell us about your experience.
Yeah, so a couple of years ago we started a collaboration with a company called Cobod, which is a 3D construction printing company that does really, really unique work. And in fact, they're not just theirs, but 3D construction printing in general is something, and I'll get back to the question in a minute, but that can be used and has been used for a lot of sustainable structures, artificial reefs, coastal barriers, other things that are really, really interesting. Some of that work is happening in Pompano, and it's very, very intriguing. But when it came to construction for more standard uses, like building a duplex, building a townhome, building a single-family home, we were looking to do projects with Miami-Dade County where we were working on getting pieces of land that would be granted for free to developers that are building housing, that then there's a cap on the price that you can sell this at so that you're able to sell to essentially first-time home buyers, and it's a way for them to be able to get a foothold into the market while having some forms of governmental assistance, either in down payments or closing costs. And it was incredibly difficult because despite the fact that the technology had been accepted in Florida building code as what is called an alternative, means and method, basically, that meant that it was still up to the discretion of some kind of local inspector or permitting department to say, yes, we're okay with this type of construction, or no, we're not. Or you know what, we're okay with 3D construction printing, but in order to do that, you have to put in rebar just like you were building a traditional wall with regular block, which actually defeats the purpose because 3D construction printing, the way that the concrete is mixed and then generated, it's actually a type of concrete that is substantially stronger, that entire structure, than what we would normally have in a regular concrete block structure. So the rebar's purpose in regular concrete block is to reinforce the structure, but if you don't need that, then you're just adding additional cost and layers through the bureaucracy that in fact made it unfeasible to do these projects through a technology whose promise is really only available through scale. You're not going to get the benefits of something like 3D construction printing by building 1 or 2 houses. You have to do this where you've got, let's say a tract builder, and you're able to do hundreds of homes. This is where you begin to get substantial efficiencies in cost and time for this type of product. And so, we were working with the University of Miami School of Architecture on designing some very, very unique plans. And then as we were doing that, we realized that we were going to have to engage in conversations with the Florida Building Commission, which updates its code only X number of years. And that process became quite tedious. Now there have been some updates to the code where 3D construction printing is now not just an alternative means and method in terms of its consideration, but just like Patrick was saying, it's one thing to maybe be accepted in some forms in code, and it's really another thing to have people understand or begin to apply a completely different way of thinking and way of executing to construction realities. And so it still hasn't taken off in a way that it could have, because when you think of building a house, you don't think of a 3D construction printer. You think of a bunch of guys putting up a whole lot of block together and then throwing rebar in it. And so that mental change still hasn't happened either on an execution standpoint from construction firms or in a government standpoint in terms of approval. So despite the fact that it may be possible through code, you still have lots of local code inspectors, permitting departments, and other authorities that do not realize that this is really possible and kind of, are not in favor of this. And so there's a lot of education. There's a high learning curve that needs to come for this kind of technology to be able to make a substantial impact in terms of what is the reality for attainable housing, affordable housing, workforce housing. And then when you look at values in general, which I think is a really important part of this story, because without incremental tax revenues and tax revenues, we really don't have a way to pay for a lot of the things that people like Amy are looking to do, right? She's going to get grants and other things, but you need tax revenue in order to pay for these things. And so, interestingly enough, stepping slightly away from 3D construction printing and just looking at values in general, in this climate change conversation, we look at the notion that there's a study, for instance, it's basically a study, it's called the LaHue study, it's a pretty famous study. And this study looked at Miami-Dade County specifically, and it looked at property values from 1995 all the way through 2019. They looked at about 627,000 transactions. Out of those transactions, you had about 400-something thousand unique parcels that were being evaluated, and what they did was look at the increase in property value over that entire period, and so they indexed it. So let's say that if the property appreciation rate was 100% from 1995 to 2019, 100 is what the market was at, and they looked at the properties that had ever been inside of a flood zone, and then the properties that had never been inside of a flood zone, and also the properties that were mean. They took into account that in 2009 there was a shift in the FEMA flood map. And so, they had them again as ever in, not ever in a flood zone, et cetera. And what they found in that study was that the properties that actually had been in a flood zone at some point, actually, if the baseline appreciation was, call it 100% as your index number, that the ones that had been in a flood zone ever really had only increased, call it 84 to 85% was their index for appreciation. And if they had been in a flood zone but then been taken out of a flood zone, they had increased, call it, by 95% out of that 100. So what does that tell us? That tells us that if you've got, according to that study, and I have thoughts on that study also, but basically through that study, which looked at general properties in Miami-Dade County, if your house that was worth, I'm just going to say $100,000 in 1995 was now worth, call it, $1 million in 2019, if it had never, ever, ever been in a flood zone. But if it had been in a flood zone at some point and it had been taken out of that flood zone at some point, then you had your property, instead of being worth, call it $1 million, was now worth maybe $950,000. So there was an incremental lack of attainment of that appreciation. And if it had been placed into a flood zone and just ever been in that flood zone and not been taken out, it really went up to about $850,000. So there was $150,000, call it, right, of lost appreciation under this idea of having been in a flood zone or having had the stigma of ever having been in a flood zone, even if you had been taken out of your flood zone. So I think this is really important because in Miami-Dade County, we're talking about a county where right now about 60-something% of the properties in our county are subject to a 30-year flood risk. And out of that, if you take just downtown Miami, you've got 90% of the properties in downtown Miami that are subject to this 30-year flood risk. So when we're looking at how can municipalities actually pay for what needs to be paid for? These are really important considerations, and that notwithstanding, you still have to subsegment by market type and property type, because when you're looking at ultra luxury properties and direct waterfront properties, these kinds of properties are substantially increasing in value despite the fact that they're at the highest levels of flood risk. So that study cannot be just applied as a broad brush, like sometimes there are studies from First Street and other organizations that kind of say, all property values are going to decline because of flood risk, and the reality is that in Miami-Dade County, our properties at the greatest level of flood risk are actually the ones appreciating the most. And so these are all just interesting points. I could go on forever, but that's it.
Patrick, you started talking about AI and how that can help streamline some of the coding process in the future to make building better and maybe faster. Do you feel like sustainability rating systems like LEED or the AI one you're working on now help encourage developers to build better?
100%. There's no doubt. I mean, David would probably speak to this better than myself. But I think we're seeing more and more requirements for more and more LEED. I think we're seeing, especially a younger generation, as David mentioned, wanting this, demanding it, making decisions of where they buy, where they rent, based on certain behaviors of whether that's a brand or whether that's a developer and what goes into that building. I think there's a lot more that can be done on that front, but follow the money, right? As David said, we all got budgets. No matter who, what, where you are, you got a budget. And if there's not a financial incentive at the end of the day, it gets tougher sometimes to meet some of these requirements. I do think, going back to that public-private partnership, there are incentives for incentivizing developers to be LEED Platinum, LEED Gold. In exchange for that, and maybe they get more density, right? Maybe they get an expedited approval instead of waiting 9 months. It's 3 months or something, right? Maybe they can use a third-party reviewer. Maybe there's tax abatements, right? There's all sorts of ideas, I think, to incentivize that behavior, and that's good for all of us, right? If more and more people start building LEED Platinum, LEED Gold, that's good for all of us. And I think at the end of the day, as several studies, it sounds like I've indicated, people are financially doing better, right? That is what the market is demanding. So we're seeing more of it, but from a construction standpoint, it's not the pace I would like to see. I think there could be more, quite frankly. And I guess from the inside, we see it all budget related. People start off with these aspirations, and they start getting the budget, and then it starts getting pulled back. It's sort of the reality of it. So I think there's got to be some offsets financially for that.
David, if you want to jump in on that, you're welcome to. Otherwise, I was going to ask you a little bit about, we've spent a lot of time talking about how we build, right? There's better technologies, there's different methods, but I think a really huge part of this conversation is where we build. As Hector just said, our waterfront property values, whoosh, not going anywhere anytime fast. But if you look at basic physics and you look at sea level rise, water's coming in. Those waterfront areas will have to be built differently. But is there a smarter place or destination or way we can build more inland? And you've talked a lot in past projects about transit-oriented development. Like, if you're going to build density, how can we build it smarter? How can we have more people near one of the other solutions we know we need for climate change, which is more people to take public transit and use electrified public transit? Tell us about your desire to have more efficient and smart density inland and near transit.
Yep. Well, living next to transit sometimes good and sometimes could be bad, right? It's sometimes a little noisier, right? A lot of it, not as much privacy, right? So I think when we think of transit-oriented developments, this new word that I know the TPO is using a lot is transit-oriented community, right? So the idea is that the transit corridor is a spine, and then we have all these ribs that connect to that transit corridor. And how do we make those ribs more accessible for people to just walk and use the transit, right? How do we change people's behavior by making it more convenient? How do we make a mile walk with no trees, no activated storefront into a very short walk, right? And so that's, I think, a lot has to do with the urban planning. 100%, we need to live closer to transit. Being able to connect with, having transit connect us to different neighborhoods is super important. Being able to, that'll reduce the cost of living for someone that lives next to transit. But we need to make the transit hub cool. We need to make it, we need to have other things other than just housing next to transit, right? And we need to think of each transit stop as a hub so that more people want to use it, want to go there. It becomes a destination that people live. But we have to change kind of the environment around it, right? All the senses, right? And, that people have. And in order to make it, really interesting, in our project in Grove Central, we have a very strong retail destination there. We have an amazing Sprouts grocery market, if anyone, would love to check it out. But I think, and we see people with no cars. Our parking, it's really ironic, right? Our parking requirement was so high there, not only from a city or county perspective, but also from the financing community. They really said, hey, we know Miami's very vehicular dependent. We want to make sure that you're going to be able to rent these homes. So build 1,000 parking spaces. We're like, what? And so what happens is, we're seeing the parking utilization, and going back to the AI comment and maybe just the data collection comment, I think we're just going to be much smarter in collecting data, whether we build a cistern, whether we build mangroves or an atoll, whether we build housing next to transit, the ability for us to really see the performance of those investments, and that is going to kind of reinforce the decision to finance the climate resilience we need. Because it's not like a toll road, right? In a toll road, you build a toll road, it's predictable, you get this revenue, and then you pay for the toll road, and you reduce the traffic, and the traffic consultant's right on point, and that's it, right? That's easy. Financing climate resilience is like it's so difficult to really do this cost-benefit analysis, and I think technology and data collection is going to be a huge element of how to make this how to make this work, and how to start putting the data in front of our decision makers and leaders in order to make the investments and to increase the priority of the budgeting side. So, but going back to inland, right? There's also technology in hydrological studies, right? And so we're able to see where areas, are flood prone, where areas aren't. And so, we have to. The problem is we have a land use map and that basically was done, when they adopted the Florida Growth Management Act, and so what happens is, we didn't have the knowledge, and stormwater and flooding was not like the priority of where density should go. So today we have to kind of really change, and we need to create adaptation action areas that kind of, that make the transit stop kind of that hub, or that resiliency hub, where people know that they could get uninterruptible power, where there's a place to go, those types of things. So definitely think that the community and the industry is already thinking and trying to create these nodes around transit. I think that's being adopted. The question is, how do we make those communities livable, right? And I think that's the challenge that we're all working on now.
So, okay. Last question. We're building more. We're building better, mostly, I think. That also creates more room for people to move here, and we know that the population is growing. Hector, you're advising clients on where to put their money, on which real estate to buy. They're spending a lot of money here. What conversations are you having with them in terms of climate change? Are they bringing that up naturally? Do you see them talk about it more and address it? Or do you tell them, hey, by the way, have you thought about that yet?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think it really depends on the type of client that you're talking about, and their socioeconomic strata, the product that they're looking for, and where they're coming from. So really, when we are dealing with, and in our group we deal with a few different levels from the different kind of divisions we've got, but when you're dealing with the ultra-luxury client that is looking for new construction, pre-construction, whether it be a single-family home that's on the direct waterfront like on the Venetian, or Palm Island, one of these places, Coral Gables waterfront, typically they just want to know that the property that they're going to be buying is resilient in and of itself, that property is high enough not to be flooded if there are problems. They don't intend to be present for a Category 5 hurricane. So, they would leave anyway. They just want to know that when they come back, the house is still going to be there and that the majority of whatever is inside its contents, right, that wouldn't have been severely affected because it was too low. So they might have basements and other things that they use in certain ways, knowing that those might be at risk, and they're okay with that. If you're dealing with people looking at pre-construction condominiums, I think some of that conversation sort of shifts to the developer in people's minds, where they kind of think between the developer and the municipality, surely they must have this covered, right? And then you get into conversations about what is the elevation of the building itself relative to the floodplain. How far above did they build this thing? Some developers go above and beyond what is required. Other developers build essentially what is required. So that's a part of the conversation, certainly. When you're dealing with more of a mid-market client, I think that then it starts to enter into the conversation a bit more, but not usually in the form of, hey, climate change, and I've heard all this on the news. It's really more about insurance. And so people are a bit more concerned about what are their insurance premiums, how does that impact the possibility of resale in the future, and that goes back to that study that we just talked about. But it's interesting because in that study, when you sub-segment it, again, you see that even the baseline values for the properties that were in a flood zone at some point are higher by like $200,000 versus the baseline values of properties that were never ever in a flood zone. So that tells us the same thing, that our waterfront or coastal properties are more highly valued than the ones that are further away from the coast and subject to lower flood risk. I think when you get into the lowest income brackets, right there the conversation really is just more about affordability than it is even the ability to resale and make bank on the flip, right? Like their whole idea is, this is the first home that my family's ever attempting to acquire. How are we able to really do this? And if we have to pay for flood insurance, is this something that is even more cost prohibitive to the process of acquiring this, so that we too can have a chance at the American dream and have that moment of equity to transform our generational wealth, right? That's more like what the thought process is. And so they're not thinking climate change, they're thinking, can I even afford it? Mid-market thinking, can I resell it and my premium? And ultra luxury, don't care.
Thank you. That's not shocking to me, actually, but so really happy to have everybody here today. While I have this opportunity, we want to give people a chance to ask questions. So, Carlos?
Good morning still. Carlos de la Cruz, I'm with the chairman of the Everglades Foundation. I have a question. We're about to complete major parts of Everglades restoration by the end of this decade, some $20 billion worth of work, and a lot more water is going to be coming down. And our concern moving forward, one of the big ones is Dade County and urban sprawl out to the west, beyond the UDB. And people talk a lot about affordable housing, which is a real concern. And then people say, well, how can you have affordable housing and then you're putting restrictions on expanding? So how can that be addressed? How can we have the city basically go up instead of going out? So,
I think huge challenge, right? At the end of the day, the question becomes single family versus condo or apartment, right? And I think that from an affordability standpoint, the problem we have is we do have certain neighborhoods that are overzoned to have the supply, but the cost to build is so expensive that just you're never going to generate the supply. So there's really no market-based solution. And traditionally what we're finding is affordability is happening through these affordable housing projects that are significant, that require grants and a lot of subsidies, and they take a lot of time to execute. And we need the housing now. If not, we're going to lose the community. So we've come up with an idea of calibrating the zoning code by providing 3-story garden apartments on 50 by 100-foot lots that are abutting commercially zoned areas. So if you look at our community in our county, we probably have a significant percentage of our built environment is single family, right? But sometimes that single family is abutting, right, a commercial corridor, abutting a commercial zone property, a shopping center, an office building, et cetera. So we're saying if we could grab those lots that are built, that are basically lots abutting that commercial zone, we're going to be able to build 3-story garden apartments, 10 units a lot, 15 units a lot. And that would give a huge small business opportunity for smaller developers, young contractors, young subcontractors to start getting into building in their neighborhoods. And this is a countywide idea, right? Where basically you're only able to build those 10 or 15 units if you meet a certain AMI score, right? For the units and rents that you're going to have. And it'll be 15 units if you're close to transit. It'll be 10 units if you're not close to transit. But overall, I think that we need to calibrate the zoning code to provide a market-based solution so we could have that missing middle housing we need. Because right now, the only other concept, right, is the tiny home concept, right, where you could create that. So I think we got to innovate in the zoning kind of calibration a little bit to kind of not have, we do have some arcane older codes, but it is a huge challenge because at the end of the day, people want a house and people want a yard, right? And so that's kind of the consumer behavior. But if we could make our neighborhoods better, right, and have more kind of, more interesting things, more job opportunities, better parks, if we can make our urban neighborhoods better and more livable, I think people are going to strive and want that urbanism and walkability instead of living, an hour or 2 hours away.
Amy, I see you wanting to jump in here.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think it's so important to adapt our existing housing stock, and that is both a challenge and an opportunity. I mentioned that Miami Beach has 14 historic districts, and that is a lot of our naturally occurring affordable housing, and people want to be there, but they also want to be safe. And so we have a program, a private property adaptation program, where people can apply for a $20,000 grant. It's a matching grant, but we will help fund improvements to your property that will help reduce your flood risk. And we just did our 3rd year. We had over 90 properties apply. And what we're hearing and what we're seeing, because we do these flood risk assessments, is that people have challenges. Properties are very low. They're having issues with water coming through their crawl spaces and impacting their subfloors. And they're seeing higher new properties going up around them. And they don't want to move. They can't afford to move. They love their neighborhood. And so how do we sort of scale that flood mitigation industry at a private property level, which really hasn't been done before and has not been contemplated? So that innovation, I think, is really important, and we need to protect the buildings, that we have. So I think that's huge. We also, I didn't get to plug the reef line before. I see my friends here, and I think we have to continue to innovate. Offshore protections are very, very important. We've got this underwater sculpture park that is going to be, planting coral, and that's going to help protect that existing stock so that people don't have to be going out to, the Everglades and that sprawl. So I think everything we can do to keep things better and more, a better place to live, but also more protected.
Thank you. Question here.
Good morning. I am not certain that either of you can answer this, but it's something that's burning on my mind. I live in a condo on the bay, for example, and we were all told that anyone who was in a condo and had a dock previously could rebuild it. And I'm wondering if that decision is still hard fast, and does that make sense to keep that in place given climate change?
I can speak for our city that we actually we just adopted a new seawall ordinance. We do expect people to build higher, because if you're going to put that investment for a new seawall, it should be higher to withstand the next 50 years of sea level rise and storms. So there's nothing that I have seen that would prohibit people from building docks or upgrading their seawalls. Not that it's easy to do.
And last question, I think, here. We'll bring you the mic.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Yokarditi Rocha. I'm the CEO of the Clio Institute. The Clio Institute has been working for the last 15 years in building climate literacy and advocacy and engagement in our community. I just came back from Climate Week last week in New York, where more than 1,000 events were held. And if I heard a common denominator in all the conversations that I have in multi-sector convenings is that we're missing a couple of key levers for moving climate resiliency and climate solutions forward. Courage is one of them, and we know that we have incredible political headwinds facing our movement. Capital, we know capital is not moving as fast as we need it. And then the other important thing was narrative change, communication. I think a lot of our citizens and residents of this state does not understand the benefits of building climate resilience. We know for $1 that we invest in climate resilience, we get 6 or somewhat in benefits. And I think climate resiliency needs a better publicist. And so my question to you is, have you considered investing in a sort of ad council that puts climate resilience as the client to talk about the economic, societal, and environmental impacts and benefits of solving this existential crisis? Because I think it could be a great public-private partnership using partners like the Miami Herald, other partners like NPR, and other media outlets out there, because we have a communication problem. We have a narrative problem. And I think it will take very creative ways of solving and making sure that this issue is a salient one. And if we want it to be salient, we need to invest in marketing and we need to invest in communication so the public understand how important it is to invest in climate resilience. So the question is for anybody who would like to chime in.
Thank you.
I'll chime in quickly. David's going to shut me up here. It's hard not to answer this politically, honestly. It's illegal to say certain words like climate change, right? The new Department of Energy, you can't say climate change. You can't talk about alternative energy. They're getting rid of solar. They're getting rid of wind. So I'm sorry, but you can't not talk about that in this conversation because it's very real, right? It's at the state level. It happens locally, not as much, thankfully, and certainly at the federal level. So, and internationally, right? The tide is, I think, somewhat turning in the opposite direction of this whole conversation globally. So yes, PR narrative needs to change locally, but in a macro scale. So I'm curious afterwards what was happening in New York in that conversation. But how important is this to us, right? When you go to vote, how big of a deal is this?
David, are you going to jump into this conversation or are you going to pass?
No, I do think, you know, climate is a word, right, that we need to use, but we also have to use kind of, you know, other words, because at the end of the day we gotta figure out how do we navigate, and I think health of individuals is, I think, an important word. I think you know national security, you know, innovation. Those we need to figure out, you know, more and more how we could start bridging these conversations, because I think once you say climate, it's just a trigger word that the person on the other side just is shutting down. And so I think we have to continue with the advocacy and just think about how to connect with someone else that maybe has different ideas. And at the end of the day, you know, if there's a business case for the initiative and we could find a business case for the initiative, why not do it? It's just smart planning and smart decisions. So thanks.
Hector, I see you jumping in here.
Thank you. So I think that it's really interesting, the prospect that you bring up. I think certainly the macro elements that Patrick brought up are very, very important, given the fact that there are perhaps restrictions coming on the language that is able to be used freely in our society to discuss things that are plain and real. I think also that, you know, when you look at it from a local standpoint, I, as a business owner, would be really happy to engage with some kind of, call it, innovation ad council, building innovation ad council, or whatever it would be, right? That uses language that is appealing on a broad scale. And, you know, I think maybe she's giving you guys possibly an interesting idea, because I think the Miami Herald is in an interesting position, just as a news organization, to maybe put groups together and some people together that could actually create campaigns that, along with partnerships with municipalities or the county, for instance, that discuss this in a way that actually has messaging that hits home for the everyday person. So not for the technocrat or the expert in climate change, but rather just for the everyday person, and how this could actually impact their life in terms of value in the long term. How could it impact their pocketbook? And those are conversations that certainly are nuanced and need to be further developed, because sometimes it is hard to make the business case for some of these items, even though we know that in the long term they make a difference. And they're hard because the incentives are really not aligned in terms of timeframes, right? Like most businesses are looking at a 7 to 10 year time frame maybe. They're not looking at a 25, 30, 40, 50, 100 year time frame or even further. So there are some macro systemic challenges to that conversation just because of the way that our capitalist society is set up to begin with. So it's a really wonderful thought exercise that I think could have some realistic applications, and I'd be happy as a business owner to contribute to something like that.
And Amy wants to jump in, and then we're gonna close.
I'll be quick, but it's a fantastic idea. We actually had a really exciting campaign in 2019, 2020 about climate resilience, and you may have seen it around Miami Beach. We had slogans like "Climate change is real, so are our solutions," "The seas are rising, so are we," you know, "Traffic is maddening, jump on the trolley." We had a lot of great campaigns, and we had a lot of people accessing our website, mbrisingabove.gov, and we still have the website, and we still do a lot of interesting communications, but the reactions were interesting. Some people just loved it, and some people really bristled at it.
Okay.
And you know, we got a lot of kudos, and then a lot of people going, maybe we don't want Miami Beach to be known for this. And it was interesting. We were doing a project with the Urban Land Institute at the time, and they said, well, you know, people kind of already know you for this. It's not a secret that, you know, we have these challenges in South Florida and Miami Beach particularly. But I don't think we've cracked that nut, but I think we have to keep trying.